in narrative work, there is been appropriation, right, of the idea that disempowering narratives, right, don't come simply from inside the individual, but right, are in the social space. What the accomplishment of Foucault was, taken up by Michael White and others, right, is to give us a narrative about the emergence of these disempowering narratives themselves in our understanding of ourselves and of one another. Right? Part of the role of externalization, right, is, we might say, to place those stories where they belong, right? Not inside the individual, right, but outside. Right? And in doing that, right, Foucault has then given us, right, an account of parts of what our social space looks like. And that account is a critical account, but it's a critical account for which, if I can use the term, he hasn't owned the norms. Right? Right? When you ask him for the norms, right, he steps back. Right? And so the question is, how might we think of the norms that structure this space? Right? And when Walter asked me to bring in Rancière, I think one of the things he saw, Walter, if I'm right, is that the notion of equality might do some work as a value, right, in terms of seeing the norms that structure narrative space. And if it's going to work, right, it's going to have to work in such a way. Now, kind of want to come back to what you asked about before. Right? It's going to have to work in such a way as to be a norm, right, that resists hierarchy, right? And that's what I want to move into now. And now we have a sense at the political level, because Sarah, you had said this was all a matter of groups, right? So we have a sense at the political level what this looks like. Right? Now, the next step is going to be to take the notion of equality, unpack it, right? See what it looks like for Rancière, and then ask the question, okay, what impact might this have in thinking about the norms, the values, right, that structure narrative space? Right? Now, before I go any further into equality, right, I want to stop and ask questions, thoughts, discussion, follow-up, anything we want on the discussion we've had so far before we take any more steps in this.
Well,
Good, Sarah.
One sort of question that was occurring to me is that, so we're talking about there's a presupposition of equality in all political action.
In all actions that he calls political.
That he calls political.
Yes.
So large-scale sort of collaborative actions on a presupposition of inequality are not, that wouldn't be politics.
Yes.
If we just get together and everybody is acting as if these groups are not equal, we're taking the actions to sort of, that would be not politics.
Yes, that would be fair. Now, are you thinking of anything in particular?
I was sort of thinking of large-scale, I was thinking Nazi Germany or something. You've got a lot of people sort of acting on collaboratively and together.
On the presupposition of inequality.
On a presupposition of inequality.
Yes.
And a lot of yeah, sort of countries that happens, and where would that wouldn't fit in here, or it's just not part of what's interesting to him.
It would not fit. It's not going to fit in here, right? And we can. Let me divide into three types of action, right? Right. There's the collective action on the presupposition of inequality, right? Nazi Germany, whites in the South defending segregation, things like that, right? That would be acting on the presupposition of inequality, okay? But you can also act collectively seeking equality without acting on the presupposition of equality in Rancière's sense. So, for instance, right? Let's suppose that we have. Let me take the South again, because we've always seen one form of action of presupposition equality. Let's suppose, right, that instead, in the lunch counter sit-ins, right, instead of people walking into lunch counters and sitting down and acting as though they were equal, right, what they did was they got a petition And in the petition, they ask the state legislature, this would have been pointless, but let's just assume they did it, right? Ask the state legislature to pass a law saying blacks and whites have equal access to lunch counters, okay? Now, that's not acting on the presupposition of inequality, but it is also not acting on the presupposition of equality, right? Because, right, you're having somebody mediate. You're not acting as though you're equal. You're asking someone to treat you as equal, okay? So that's not the Nazi Germany example, right? But it's not the politics he's talking about, right? So far, so good, right? Okay. Now, the other thing I want to add to this is, okay, why this, right? What's special about this, right? And go ahead, John.
Just to raise, aren't these relatively new ideas in themselves, the idea of equality and human rights as a concept? So he's building on ideas that are more recently entering into our social and political structures. I don't think equality and human rights were very much a part of French history.
Yeah, yes. There's a deep question here, which is it possible to act on the presupposition of equality without that term equality being one that gets used much? Okay? In other words, okay, I'm sorry.
No, I just think that he and others are bringing this to attention.
Yes.
And to a consciousness.
Yes.
That this is something that we have to rethink our policing and management of populaces, because I don't think they were built on equality.
That's right. That's right. And as a value, it wasn't as socially as prominent, right? But one thing we want to be careful of as well, you can act collectively on the presupposition of equality without knowing that's what you're doing, right? So you imagine the folks who sat down at lunch counters were not saying to themselves, hey, cool, look, let's all act on the presupposition of equality and see what turns up, right? Right? But they were doing it, right? So there's a difference between acting on the presupposition of equality and reflectively recognizing that's what you're doing. Now, this is, to engage in the reflective project has its own advantages, right? But it can happen without people telling themselves theoretically that's the case. Now, if that's true, John, one more step we could take, and Rancière took this step, was to say there was, even in ancient times, collective actions out of the presupposition of equality, even though that wasn't a term that they used to characterize themselves.
What is the presupposition of equality or resistance to domination?
Well, there are various forms of resistance to domination, right? Right. One, if I come back to Sarah's question, you can resist domination by asking someone to pass a law, or you can resist domination by acting out of the presupposition of equality, right? What he wants, he says, the thing he is interested in is that action, out of that particular way of resisting domination. Not, if I say not mediated, right? Not mediated through someone else, right? But by taking it upon yourself simply to presuppose the equality against, right, the presupposition of inequality that's in that partition of the sensible, right? That you presuppose your equality, and he says, that's what I'm interested in, right? But the question still is, why that, right? What makes that special? Right? And for Rancière, right, the special character of it is that it is empowering in a way, right, that, if I say what we call mediated action, right? Mediated action lacks, right? It is, and the term that he uses, right, is it is emancipatory. Right? He says what people acting out of the presupposition of equality do, right, is they not only give a lesson to those around them who are acting on the presupposition of their inequality, right, but he says emancipation is also a lesson to oneself in one's own equality. Right? So Mark, you talked about before about people coming into your office who've adopted the hierarchy on which they're the wrong side. Right? Now, this kind of disempowerment, right, is characteristic of lots of populations, right? And in acting collectively out of the presupposition of equality, he says that the emancipation is also a proof to oneself of one's equality. Okay? And that's one of the things he thinks makes it special, right? Right? It's not that petitioning the government for more equality is terrible, right? It's that this is a special form of political action, a special form that engages, right, not simply in challenging, right, the hierarchy that's in play, but also, right, in bringing oneself into an equality that one might have denied oneself because one's acting on the very presuppositions, right, that characterize that social space. Hannah.
But if they got killed for what they did, like the
Right.
liberating act, but in the time period that you're talking about, a lot of those liberating acts ended their lives.
Yes.
So how is that a liberating act?
Good. This is going to come. I want to say there's several things I want to say all at the same time, and then sort of crowd in, and then I. No. No. The question is whether I'm going to give you half of one answer and half of another. For Rancière, politics isn't defined by its success or failure. What he calls politics, right? It's not defined by its success or failure. Right? It's defined by the structure of the action itself. In other words, if we're acting out of the collective presupposition of equality, this might or might not result in a social change. Right? Whether it results in a social change is contingent on a number of factors, right? Are people hearing it? Is it coming at the right time, et cetera, right? But what he calls politics is a particular way of acting politically. It's a particular process of political action. And if it's a particular process of political action, right, the emancipation is in the process itself. What emancipation there is in that process. Right? So it can result. He says, sometimes politics results in an obligation to hear, right? And then it becomes more successful. Right? But whether or not it is successful, right, and this would include whether or not there are casualties, right, is going to be in the process itself, right? Right. But now the question is, right, how do we think about this? Go ahead, John.
Is he saying that equality is in itself a value?
Oh, yeah.
And so he's starting with the value.
Yes. Yes.
And that is better than a domination system.
Yes, right. The idea is that he is starting with the idea, right, that equality beats hierarchy. Remember? And hierarchy just presupposition of inequality, right? And says, how is it that this can become instantiated in movements? Right? And sees politics as what he calls politics as emerging from that. Tell me your name.
Yeah, Joanna.
Joanna.
Okay. He would talk about politics in terms of the collective or group activity.
Mm-hmm.
Would he also say that perhaps the greatest value was what it did to the individual who was part of this political system? I'm thinking of the civil rights movement in the United States, the liberation theology movement in Latin America, El Salvador, etc., where there were terrible abuses that took place and killings and so forth. But it absolutely what it did to the individuals that I'm thinking primarily Latin America here.
Mm-hmm.
What it did to the individuals, the campesinos that were involved in those movements was monumental in terms of the feeling of equality.
Yes. No, that's
yeah.
Joanne, that's exactly right. That's the side of emancipation where one emancipates oneself. And if we look at that, let's take another example, right? Apartheid, right? So during the resistance to apartheid, there was a period in which, right, those who remember the name Stephen Biko, right, the idea was it was a black movement. There was a sense of black identity emerging, right? And that sense of black identity was not, right, simply anything to segregate, but rather, right, that because blacks had just seen as inferior to whites, you have whites and then you have not quite whites, right? Actually, you have three in South Africa, right? You have the whites, the Indians who are not quite whites, and then the blacks who are not even nearly Indians, right? So that so that movement, Biko's movement, was a way of, we could say, leveraging in, right, a presupposition of equality that actually helped to emancipate the people who were in the movement, right, to end apartheid, right? And that's why, if I can use a Marshall example, right, or Marshall metaphor, it's like a two-edged sword, right? That on the one hand, it cuts against the presupposition of inequality that those who are privileged relative to that inequality, right, it challenges them. But it also, on the other hand, emancipates, and Joanne, exactly what you're talking about, emancipates those who are participating in it, right? But only as a process, right? It may or may not be successful. In other words, politics for him is defined as a certain process, not by its success. You're going to say something else?
Well, that this movement would be at odds with the police here. Would that describe the official government sources or the official government position? So this movement of equality would be at odds with the official, often at odds with the official.
It could well be, but it's almost always at odds with this. The way people are living spaces in terms of certain partitions, right? This oftentimes, this always, right? There's a partition getting challenged here, right? Right. But now, swing back to this term, equality, right? I want to unpack that some more, right? And in looking at that term, right, one might ask, equality of what, right? What is it that we are supposed to be equal in? It seems an empty term, right? And Rancière's answer to this, he takes up from a book he wrote called The Ignorant Schoolmaster. And the story that the book recounts is fascinating. Right? There was, in revolutionary France, one of the radicals participating was a French revolutionary named Joseph Jacques. Right? And I should write this down, shouldn't I? Last name. Right. And during the Restoration, Jacques had to flee. Right? He went to Flanders, right, where they spoke Flemish but didn't speak French. He was hired as a teacher of French to Flemish students, right, at university. Right? The only problem, he doesn't know any Flemish. Right? All he's got is a novel. I actually didn't know that they made novels like this back in the late 1700s. He's got a novel, right, a popular novel at the time called Telemachus, right? And the novel is bilingual, right? So one page is French, right? Then the translation to Flemish, right? These bilingual editions of things. Right? He's got this bilingual edition of Telemachus. Right? That's all he's got to work with. Right? And he wants the students to learn French, even though he can't communicate with them in Flemish. He can only communicate with them in French. So he uses this novel and gives them a test, right? Makes them learn this stuff, right? Without his being able to lead them along, right? They learn it through the text. Gives them a test in French, rendering aspects of Telemachus. And they do great, right? They make superior performance, right? And Jacques decides something strange, right? He decides that everyone has equal intelligence. Right? He says the differences between people are not in their intelligence. The difference between people is in their attending to the material. So if you teach hierarchically, such that you're the master and they're, right, to follow you, right, they will not display their intelligence because they won't attend. Right? But if they are put in a position in which they must display their intelligence, Jacques argues, right, they can display it equally, right, or nearly equally. Right? He decides he's going to test this presupposition. So what he does is he picks an area that he knows nothing about in order to teach it. Flemish law, right? Right? He asked to teach a course in Flemish law, right? So here's a guy who can now hardly speak Flemish, so doesn't know the first thing about Flemish law, right? He teaches the course, students excel, right? Because they're doing all the work, right? What he's doing is getting them to focus and attend to it, right? But they're doing the work, right? And they excel. And so he goes on, spends his career teaching things he doesn't know anything about, probably doesn't know anything more about them when he ends the course than when he began the course, right? But his students all know more, right? So he decides, right, that people are of equal intelligence and that it is the hierarchies that allow us to think otherwise, right? In other words, hierarchies are disempowering in a particular way, right? They are disempowering in that they will give the appearance of the inequality of intelligence, right, as people take them up, rather than the equality of intelligence. Right? So what he argues then is that political movements ought to engage, right, in such a way as to presuppose the equality of everyone's intelligence. I'm going to come back to the equality of intelligence in a minute, right? So you're looking at me like, yeah, we better do that, right? Right, so we're going to come back to the equality of intelligence, but the idea is, what Rancière says is, in doing politics, the object is not to prove the equality of intelligence. The object is to presuppose the equality of intelligence and see how far that can get us. Right? In other words, right? He's saying in politics, rather than ratify Jacques Rancière as making an empirical claim. The empirical claim is everybody's equally intelligent, and he's got this strange evidence of his teaching to prove it. He's saying, look, rather than saying here's an empirical claim on which we can base a politics, he's saying, look what happened when Jacques Rancière presupposed the equality of everyone, right? Presupposed their equal intelligence. So maybe what politics is about is less showing, displaying, giving evidence of the presupposition, giving evidence of the equality of intelligence, but rather presupposing the equality of intelligence and seeing how far that can lead us. Right? Now, right, we often will balk at this idea of the presupposition of equality of intelligence. Why will we balk at it? Because, right? I walk into a room. I'll use myself as an example. That I spent some time trying to understand Einstein's concept of relativity, right? And in doing that, there was a book by Einstein, and it said on the cover of the book, it says, with only a high school education, right, you can understand relativity as Einstein has laid out. The book was by Einstein, right? Now, I don't know what high school these folks went to, right? But I had no idea, right? I thought maybe I had the Hebrew edition, so maybe read from the back, maybe that will do me better, right? Right? I just had no way of making sense of this stuff, right? So whatever the presupposition of the equality of intelligence is, right, it can't involve my understanding relativity, right? But some people do, right? Some people get it, right? So what might be, right, this equality of intelligence that is presupposed? Right? Rancière doesn't offer an answer, right? But I'm here to offer one for him, right? Which is, right? I think what he's trying to get at, and what's politically relevant, and then what's going to become, I hope, narratively relevant, is that in presupposing the equality of intelligence, what we're presupposing is that people are capable, alongside other people with whom they should share the society, of conceiving their lives and life plans, right? Of thinking about what's important to them, of forming directions, right, in ways, right, that may not always be right, but certainly are sort of in the ballpark, right? That we're all capable of doing this, and we don't need someone to do it on our behalf, right? We don't need someone to tell us, here's how your life needs to go, right? Now, in that, right, you can begin to see the narrative stuff come out, which I'm going to try to make more explicit in a bit, right? But I think that's what the equality of intelligence is. Not that we all understand relativity or string theory, right? Or that we can do advanced symbolic logic or anything like that, right? It's the idea that most of the tasks that life requires of us are tasks that almost all of us, unless we're particularly damaged in one way or the other, right, most of all of us can actually engage in alongside others and don't need someone to tell us, here's what you need to do. Now, be really careful here. That doesn't mean that no one can be helpful, right? That doesn't mean no one can give us advice. Doesn't mean we can't be wrong, right? But the idea is that if we are mistaken, right, we're not mistaken because that person simply has a superior intelligence, right? We're mistaken because we're fallible. Some people know some things, other people know other things, but none of us is at a level that when it comes to conducting a life, right, envisioning how it might go, seeing it unfold, forming life plans, is in a position that they can be dictating to the others, to here's how it ought to go. Right? So the presupposition of equality, right, is precisely that presupposition that undergirds, right, this collective action, and, right, I'm going to transition in a minute, right, will also undergird, I believe, right, as a value, right, the narrative work. Michael.
Can I balk?
What?
I want to balk.
People do balk, right, at this moment.
It seems to me your line of argument is kind of, you're taking a very individualistic notion of human behavior and saying, you know, I as an individual don't necessarily need other people to help me define my story.
Not exactly, but I wanted to make a distinction. Go ahead.
The underlying assumption, I think, that you're missing in the way you're presenting this is that we're social beings, and there's no such thing as a self without another. And that it's in the process of that negotiation, individually and collectively, that we form a sense of ourselves. And to say that it's like that American rhetoric of, well, you know, I'm my own person, you know, no one tells me what to do, kind of stuff. And it seems to me it undermines the very basis of narrative therapy, which is that healing comes in discussions. And sometimes we label, you know, the discussion can be labeled authoritative or telling someone else what to do, but it's hopefully a healing story or a healing discussion. You know, it's mutually respectful. And the whole idea of the presupposition of equal intelligence, I think, is really misleading. I think what you're getting at is a presupposition of equal dignity, not intelligence, because there's so many people who have like frontal lobe problems, polarization, planning, coping, illness, stress. There's all this different, and many people have very serious impairments of those things. If to say that anyone has there's not a hierarchy of abilities of coping, especially around the executive functions of the brain, it just doesn't make sense to me.
Jump in.
Well, I could take sort of the opposite view and looking at somebody with TBI or some other, you know, big problems. One of the things that I think Rancière is sort of saying is they probably have the right to determine what they want in their life. In other words, would even if they had those difficulties, would they have the right to say, I want to be married, I want to be able to earn a living, I want to have a good life, I want to be happy. Now, they might not on their own be able to figure out exactly how to get there and might need some assistance, but do they have the right to say that they have a right to determine kind of what their own goals are?
But that to me would be like a contested concept, like my right to determine my own goals. Most of the, you know, in reality, we adapt to our environment and our circumstances. There's very few people who set up, here's my goals, this is what I want, and society does not guarantee anyone fulfillment of their goals. We certainly have a right to pursue our goals.
That's where I'm going.
Right.
And there's no promises there, but that sense of, do they have an equal right
Sure.
Right.
to
And let me, was that?
Process.
Well, that,
Not necessarily if the results are what, you
Right.
know, that we don't have a right to be happy or whatever, but that we have.
right, the right to the process.
Process.
Well, now, and let me
Which is
take
whatever
that,
might look like.
and I want to take this idea, all right, and come back, because Michael, I think there is, remember I started to balk at the beginning of what you were saying, and then I want to agree with the second part? I want to agree with the second part precisely for the reason that I was uncomfortable with the first part, right? Okay, right. The presupposition of the equality of intelligence, right, is, I said, the presupposition that we can form lives, envision them alongside others, right? Not each one all by themselves, right? What the equality of intelligence denies is not, right, the necessity of social interaction. Right? What it denies is is the authority of someone to tell you from on high, right, who you ought to be, right, and who you are best being. Right? So it is a presupposition of, we could say, now I'm going to, remember my cards are going to start coming out on the table, presupposition of the equality of conversational partners, right, as opposed to a presupposition, and this would be a presupposition characteristic of a lot of traditional therapy, that there's an expert, they will know where your good lies, and that, right, you need to listen to the expert who will tell you where your good lies. It's not a denial of sociality, right? It's a denial of a particular kind of hierarchy, right? But that denial of a particular kind of hierarchy, you use the term, right, equality, right, of dignity, right? The problem with going down that road is that dignity then becomes a concept that we have to unpack, right? I think what Rancière is on about is if we can say the thing to be respected is the equal intelligence of, right, in political activity, the equal intelligence of everyone in the movement, as well as our adversaries, right? But as we move into conversational space, right, the equal ability of all participants in this conversational space to be able to contribute. Right? Now remember, as we talk about this, right, talk about the equality of intelligence is not the same thing as saying the identity of intelligence. Right? It's not all that we know the same things. It's not all that we know the same amount. Right? It's that we are capable of conceiving lives alongside others in interaction with others in such a way as to be able, right, to, in whatever social space we're moving in, to be able to determine, right, how lives go. Right? That's why I think the equality of intelligence works, because the equality of dignity becomes another placeholder that needs to be sorted out, and different philosophers sort it out in different ways. Right? Kant thinks it's the possession of pure rationality and things like that. But the equality of intelligence tells us, okay, look, right, we're going to assume as we get together in this conversation, right, we're going to assume that our intelligences are equal. We're not going to assume they're identical, right? We had different life experiences. But we're going to assume that we are equal conversational partners. And where this goes, right, what is called therapy, but I know people are sort of, that word itself can be a little bit shaky in every, where the narrative work, right, call it that, where the narrative work goes, it goes as a result of an interaction presupposing, right, and respecting the equality of intelligence of those people participating in it. Right? So, right, let me step back from narrative work, and then I'm going to swing back into it. Right? In South Carolina, I spent some time organizing, and I was organizing in the black community. Clemson is very small. It's 11,000. Black community was 10%, so it's like 1,100. Right? And this is as racially polarized a town, right, as you'd want to see, right? So you have professors, university, professors at the university, professionals, stuff like that, and right, the blacks who live in the community, janitors, they work the garbage. It's like that. You have a few black professors, not very many, right? But you have a very strict racial hierarchy. Right? What happened was there was a black kid who was on the street. He was hit by a car. Well, actually, it seems he was on the sidewalk. He was hit by a car. He was killed. The driver was white, middle class, not irrelevant to the story. The driver's uncle was a sheriff in Greenville County. Right? Police arrive. They give a walking test, walk a straight line to the driver. Right? Do a blood alcohol test on the black teenager who's lying dead in the road. Determine black teenager's drunk, must be his fault. Right? Even though the cops testified they smelled alcohol on the driver's breath. Right? They didn't insist on this. Right? This did not sit well with the black community. Right? There was a big meeting. I have background in organizing. People encouraged me to go. Right? So I went and I watched what was going on, and I saw some of the people who were in the black community who were people seemed to sort of look to them, right, as voices, right? And there was one woman in particular who was seemed central. So I went up and I said, look, I have background in organizing. If I can be helpful, let me know, right? Well, it turns out, right, that they never did organize in the black community, or they hadn't for 30 years. And the reason they hadn't organized was that there was somebody who had organized in the black community in Clemson. Right? He was a homeless guy. I used to see walking the streets. I didn't know who he was. Right? What happened was he was dragged into the police station, right, beaten, right, around the head, right, till he lost his mind, right, and then let out on the streets. And he was the symbol. Here's what happens if you organize. Right? So for 30 years there had been no organizing. Right? So what I brought, right, was a set of organizational skills. Right? I mean, I could do things like, I ask, okay, how many black neighborhoods are there? There are 6, right? And how many people are in them? And we, okay, well, how about on Saturday we'll hit this neighborhood and these houses? And so, just the kind of obsessive stuff that organizers do, right? But here's what I didn't know how to do, right? I had no idea how to talk to people I was organizing in rural black South, right? I mean, I knew how to do it in Pittsburgh. I knew how to do it in New York, right? In New York, come on, sign the petition. Come on, go, right? And then move on, right? Not how you do it in South Carolina, right? Right? And I was taught very quickly, here's what you do, right? We would show up at the door, we chat, right? We sit down, we have sweet tea, right? Maybe a little cake, right? Talk for half an hour, eventually work our way into this, right? And I'm thinking, this is all, and it was really uncomfortable for me to do, right? But it was clear this was how this was done, right? Now think of what's going on here, right? I am not organizing the community. I always use the term organizing with. I'm organizing with the community. And in organizing with the community, my intelligence is not identical to the people, right, in the black community that I'm organizing with, right? We have equal intelligence, but not identical intelligence. I have certain skills, right? They have certain skills. If I had shown up, right, presupposing, look, I'm the organizer here, just listen to me, right? It would have been a dismal failure, right? Because I would have not been respecting the quality of intelligence, which, right, the people, right, and all the people in the community possessed. And as the opportunities emerged for people, as they start to develop a sense of hope, wow, we can make a change, right? Right? You could see, right, the equality of intelligence emerging in a public and vocal way, in ways they would talk in front of the city council and things like that. And in that way, right, what we were able to coordinate for a couple of years, right, was a collective action out of the presupposition of equality. Right? And by the way, I hadn't read Rancière. It was when I read Rancière that I thought back, wait, that's what we were doing, right? I hadn't thought of it that way, but that's what was going on, right? I think the reason I was, because my background tends to be more anarchist, which is going to lead you to, doing these sorts of things. But in any case, you see that not the identity of intelligence, but the equality of intelligence, presupposing that all of us working collectively, right, in one way or another, can enhance one another without anyone being the authority, right, that ultimately say, this is how it needs to, I know how it needs to go. Right? Now take that, I want to swing back now, right, to narrative work. Right? I want to describe a little bit of it in narrow. Then what I want to do is get you guys in groups a little bit, right? So you can discuss stuff, and then we can come back together and spend the last part of the time talking about whatever would be good to talk about based on what happens in the groups. But if you are collaborating, right, in a conversational endeavor with someone, presupposing that they are as intelligent as you in the way we have been talking about, then you're likely to approach them not as though, hey, look, I've got the answers, and when you can sit still long enough, I'll tell you what they are, right? Or this sort of, I say that sometimes the psychoanalytic pretense, right? Right? If you talk long enough, you'll get to the right answer. I'll let you know when it happens, right? But rather, right, on the idea that we are both coming here, that there is a problem to be solved, right? And we will work on this problem together. I will contribute things. I'm not sure yet what I have to contribute, but I've got some background. Maybe this will be helpful. You will have your expertise, right? And together, right, we will work, not always where we know where, right? Because if one of us knew where, well, if I knew where, I'd just tell them, right? If they knew where, they wouldn't be here in the first place, right? So we work, right? We know not quite where in order to solve a problem that we have in front of us. Right? Now, if that is right, if that's right, then it is misleading to say that narrative therapy works without values. Right? Narrative therapy works with, and there may be other values, but the one I'm pressing today, right? It works with a very strong value, right? A value presupposing the equality of intelligence of all the partners in the conversation. Right? And to do that, right, is to say, right, that in taking up Foucault, right, in taking up the work that's been done by the generation before Rancière, right, that what the stage has been set to see, right, what the disempowering narratives are, but in acting on them, right, in engaging in conversational work, right, that there is a value that one brings to bear. Right? This value, I think, has often been implicit in narrative work. That's to say, it hasn't been brought out as a value. Right? But my suggestion is, right, that what was implicit be brought out as explicit. You can only reflect critically on things you can make explicit. Right? That it be brought out and made explicit. Right? And that looking at the structure that Rancière has, right, is a way of bringing out this central value to narrative work. Okay? Now, I'm going to say one more thing before I get you in groups. Well, first, are we okay so far?
One quick question. When you talk about equality and the presupposition of equality, does that preclude any appeal to authority for like going and talking to a council, having a petition to turn into authority? Because if they're authority and you're subject to them, is that inequality?
Good. It's many movements are structured somewhat by the presupposition of equality and somewhat within a police order. Right? I've described elements of the of black struggle in the South, right, presupposing the equality. But there were others too. Right? Thurgood Marshall was litigating cases. Right? There were attempts at legislation. All of this would be police work in the sense that Rancière talks about it, and none of it is bad because it is police work. Right? The problem is, right, that it's and when you act on someone's behalf, right, there isn't, and I want to come back to Joanne, what you talked about before, there isn't as much of that emancipation going on, right, as when you act on your own behalf, right? So movements will tend, some movements are just police movements, right? But movements will tend to have a mix of Rancièrean politics and what Rancière calls police, right, engagement. It tends to have both, right? And there's something else I should say as well. To say that a movement presupposes the equality of intelligence is not the same thing as for it really to do so. Okay? And I'll give you an example, right? In South Carolina, right, we have a group, the vast majority of this state belongs to this group, right? And this group is conservative Christians. And the discourse of conservative Christians in South Carolina is a discourse of inequality. Not just that we conservative Christians, right, with a Tea Party governor, right, are under siege, treated unequally, and we need to be treated equally. What is treating us equally consistent? Well, I'll tell you what it consists, and they're very clear, right? Banning gay marriage, right? Banning abortion, right? Not engaging in any kind of action, right, that will address the massive racial inequalities that characterize South Carolina, right? Right? And if you try to, right, allow gay marriage, address racial inequalities, you are presupposing the inequality of us, right? That's the discourse, right? It's the official discourse. I don't know where they learned it. I feel like I get the sense sometimes there's this big room, right? Like you go in, once you learn it, you get a certificate and you can move on, right? Right? But, and Colin, what I wanted to say is that to say one is presupposing the equality is not the same thing as presupposing it. So this is a very complex space then, because I said to John earlier, I said that one can act on the presupposition of equality without actually telling oneself or even knowing what's doing, right? It's there in the action. Is the action itself expressing the presupposition of equality, right? So one can act on it without knowing one's acting on it, or one can say one's acting on it, right, without acting on it. So how do you tell? Well, you look at the movement itself, right? Is the movement displaying the presupposition of equality? And it's something that probably in marginal cases people can argue about, right? It's not like there's going to be a hard and fast set of criteria, but we get a sense of it, right? I mean, it's not hard to see that the conservative Christians of South Carolina are not really presupposing the equality of gays and blacks, right? It's just not hard to see, right? Whereas in the lunch counter movement, but it's hard to interpret that as anything other than people just expressing their equality, right? So it's the assessment of equality, right, how it plays is a complex one. And it's probably going to be, well, I don't know, as complex, but certainly complex in conversational work, right? Right? It's going to revolve reflective space where people are asking themselves, well, what am I presupposing here, right? And I take the part of narrative practice is to reflect on when am I bringing the discourses or practices of inequality into the room with me, right? When is that happening, right? And if you don't reflect on it, right, you're more likely to do it than if you reflect on it. Now, granted, if you reflect on it, there's no guarantee that you're not going to do it, right? But the reflection offers the possibility of being able to think it through and seeing it more clearly, right? So if we take up Rancière then and his notion of equality as they value the structures, now we can, let's say, bring it into practice, ask ourselves, well, are we doing it or are we not, right? Without engaging what I think is sometimes a misleading move of saying, look, right, the values aren't ours. The values are all on the client side, right? We just come in, we talk, right? But they dictate, right, the values, right? Okay, so far. Good. We can discuss in groups, right? Yes, good? Okay, why don't we get in groups like 3 or 4, like about 10 minutes to start, and then if we need a few more minutes, I'll let you, right? Good? Yeah. So let's start with you guys were the first one to ask for more time, right? So there's stuff that came up, stuff that we want to touch in this group here, right?
Yeah, we just took a long time introducing ourselves and asking each other questions, but yes, we did want more time. Well, we had just started talking about the enjoying, but finding the conversation about intelligence challenging.
Okay. And in what way?
I think just the way we're conceptualizing intelligence and maybe some of us are struggling with that idea of it being equal, and we didn't get very far in our discussion, but that's looking at it in different ways for how we use it in our own practices, in our own lives, helps to bridge that gap between like Sarah was saying about looking at as capacity as a person's capacity to change, or I was even thinking of a sense of agency, things that are, like, the definitions of them don't equal intelligence, but of thinking of it in our own ways to help understand this concept.
It seems like,
Go ahead, Sarah.
oh, it just seems like intelligence, when you were talking about intelligence, there seemed like there were two different intelligences that you were talking about. First, there was sort of this discussion of this ability or capacity to learn Flemish law, or,
Right.
you know, to conceptualize relativity, which was sort of dealt with the capacity for ordering abstract concepts and learning, memorizing them and making sense of them.
Right.
And then the conversation shifted and we were talking about sort of the ability to take your own life and project it into the future. And those didn't, I guess I'm curious about the congruence between those two intelligences.
Good, good. Yes, right. And let me say something about that, Sarah, and then also something about the come back to Aaron, right? What Aaron was saying as well. The shift, and I should have actually probably been clear about why I was making this shift. Right? The shift is that Jacques Rancière is presupposing the equality of intelligence, period, right? And for most of us, that's so counterintuitive, right? That it seems hard to, it seems hard to get our minds wrapped. I mean, look, I mean, as we all know, when you're driving, right, to presuppose the equality of intelligence of other drivers is hard enough, right? Right? But to presuppose, this high-level stuff is not, it's really hard, and I would say not necessary. It's not necessary to Rancière's project, right? So what seems more necessary, and again, Rancière doesn't cash this out, but what seems necessary is the second type you were talking about. So that was the shift, and you're right, I should probably mark that better, right? That from Jacques Rancière's, very capacious view that we're all just equally capable of learning Flemish law or whatever, right? To the idea that I think characterizes political movements and characterizes narrative work, the presupposition of the equality of intelligence of people to direct their lives alongside others, et cetera, right? But in looking at that now, I want to go back to what you said a moment ago, which is that I think sometimes we bounce back and forth between a couple of things, right? One, presupposing the equality of intelligence as a way to move forward, and the other, I might call it verifying the equality of intelligence, right? Seeing if we can find it, right? Seeing if we can show that it's there, right? These are two very, very different things. Right? And when Rancière talks about, he says, look, all we want to do is presuppose the equality of intelligence and see how far we can go with that. Right? I think he's encouraging us to move away from asking, is it really true? And asking, what can we do with it? Right? If we start here, right, where will this lead us? Okay? And that's what I think that he's on about, right? But we do tend to, like, when we hear that, we want to say, well, look, that guy who cut me off, he's an idiot, right? Right? But the object, I think, is the presupposition. Tell me your name, because Denise.
I would say that I keep thinking about how it causes us to reflect on the hazards of a hierarchical
Yes.
system. So not only let's see what is happening, but also gives us a position where we can question the hierarchical presupposition versus the other.
Yes, yes. And as I was trying to say at the end, right, question it not simply in its existence in society, and not simply in its existence in the conversational partner, but where might we be presupposing, right, inequality in our own work? It gives us a way to reflect upon our own practices, right, our own practice. Hannah, you had a hand up.
So when it comes to driving, I actually would use this antithetically, because when it comes to driving, I drive in a very aggressive country, and actually by presupposing that people don't have the same amount of caution and intelligence allows me not to get into accidents. So now I'm just thinking that there's going to be Dafka time. Dafka means there's going to be specific times where I'm going to want to claim the opposite of this, where I'm going to practice the opposite of this. And we were just talking about how, with a client, how this would allow a phenomena to occur where even if somebody had committed some crime that was, disgusting to me, that I could still open myself to equality of intelligence, because that didn't have to conclude my, have me judging them as a person.
Right.
So that's what I was thinking, using it before, but when you brought up the traffic paradigm, I thought, oh, so there's situations where I would use this to do the opposite.
Yeah. Yeah. And I should just say on the traffic issue, not entirely relevant to Rancière, is that, I grew up in New York. I'm been living in South Carolina for, and New Yorkers drive extremely aggressively, right? And I piled our kids in the minivan one time with my wife, and we drove up to New York, and we're in the traffic, and I'm doing what I do in New York when I drive, right? I'm cutting people off, they're cutting me off, and there's one point where there's this little room to squeeze, right? And I'm pushing, and you could see the guy trying to cut in, and I'm pushing, and I realized the guy came from behind me, right? Which means he saw South Carolina plates, right? So I rolled down the window, right? And I say, don't let the plates fool you, buddy. I'm from New York, right? and he said, like that. And I got through. Michael.
About the presupposition of equality, it might be useful to insert like the Kantian notion of is and ought. That the like when the sit-in people sat in
The lunch counters. The lunch counters?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Their presupposition was inequality, as it is. The presupposition it ought to be equality, but by not inserting that the is and the ought in what is and what we aspire to, I think some makes it more confusing.
Yeah, the way I want to cast it is this, right? That the value, right? If you say people are equally intelligent, that's a claim about what is, right? But the value that they're acting on is as they act it out, right? They are acting on, right? It is the presupposition of equality informing their action that is the value.
But I don't think I'm alone, but to assume that there's equality of intelligence and it's equally distributed, when we know there's a bell shape.
But they're not necessarily a bell-shaped in the more moderate notion of intelligence I'm using, right? When there may be a bell shape if we're bringing in string theory and Flemish law and things like that. But I don't think there's a bell curve when we're talking about people's ability to start directing their lives.
But if we use Daniel Goldman's concept of emotional intelligence, problem solving, adapting, there's still a bell shape. We see people who are on the lower end of the bell shape who don't function very well, don't make good choices, and who have been overwhelmed in their...
Still, Michael, I'm going to take issue with it. Right, you haven't had a chance to speak to that.
I just think that Rancière, if I am understanding you, is not saying that we have equality of intelligence. He's saying let's assume that we have equality of intelligence and see where it leads us. We're not proving that we're all equally intelligent. We're starting with this belief and seeing where it goes.
That, and I think one of the things he thinks will emerge is that what looks like inequality of intelligence turns out to be other forms of disempowerment, right? I want to go to this group right here. You guys look like you're having an animated discussion, right?
We really were enjoying the presupposition of equality in general, and we were discussing different ways that we would use it in our various practices, and also just relating to it on a personal level, I think. We started talking about Jana's work, especially with kids and IEPs, and how they kind of presuppose an inequality in intelligences, and how that, and how turning that on its side would be really helpful in working not only with the kids, but with the parents and the educators.
Could you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, I can, and it's going to speak to sort of what Michael says, is I get really frustrated working with kids, even kids who are autistic and not auditory, and how their behaviors are seen as not making good choices and slapping mom's hand out of the way. Well, if you start tracking and you start really watching, the slapping mom's hand out of the way and the kicking of the clinician or the kicking of the parent really has a lot to do with it. So everybody's trying to get them to move in a space in a way, but they don't want to move in that space, and they don't fit into the norm. And so I have all of these kids on IEPs, and I get so frustrated.
Help me out 1 second.
They're
IEP.
all smart.
Individual education.
Oh, individual education.
I'm sorry. Okay,
plans.
good. Thanks.
They have a learning disability, and every single one of them, I can't help it because I see them as smart. And I just feel like, what am I, just positive Patty or what? Right, Mark? I said this with you. How frustrating it is because they're very intelligent.
Mm-hmm.
If you just let them be who they are and find ways to work and track.
Right.
And in play therapy, they move whatever mastery of that environment that they get in there, they move it into other environments. Eventually, it takes a long time. And I'm not saying it's a perfect world, but if we just see them with more presupposition of equal intelligence, I think we'd get a lot further.
Right. I mentioned yesterday, right, how I got a teaching license in New York, right, but they told me I was never going to teach in New York because I said LSD is not habit forming. And when I was doing a practicum as an undergraduate, I had a kid, right, that I was supposed to work with, I think, twice a week in a poor school to read, right? And the kid didn't read at all. And I walked in, and the kid said, I'm going to give you the guy's name. His kid's name was Kevin, right? I said, I'm going to give you Kevin to work with, but I want you to know Kevin's not going to learn to read, right? He doesn't have the ability to read. He's not going to get the ability to read. So you work, all right, with him as you like, right? And that seemed to be a fairly harsh pronouncement on a 9-year-old, right? So I tried to figure out for a while, and it was a lot of errors, right? But he didn't have a motivation, right? And so what I did was eventually, it took me long enough to figure this out, right? I figured I would send him on treasure hunts. So he would have to learn to read the clue, right? To get to the next spot, to find the thing, right? So at the end, right, he's reading. So what looks like, right, the inequality of intelligence turns out, if one presupposes equality of intelligence, but now, and this is very Jacques Rancière, right? Presupposing equality of intelligence and presupposing the problem is attending rather than intelligence. Right? What turned out in this kid's case, right, was that he was able to do it, right? And he read okay. It wasn't great, but in fact, right, it was clear that he could have kept going with the presupposition of the equality of intelligence in place. Yeah, no, I think, Janet, that's right. And again, this was a special ed class, right? Yeah. That was it IEP? Yeah, same thing. Yeah. Now let me go at least one more. You guys? Good? Yeah?
Well, I think, like probably all of the groups, I kind of felt like I got thrown a curve because we were initially talking about presupposition of equality, and then you added this.
The intelligence. Yeah.
So that's kind of where we were hung up. What does that mean? And I was wondering, did Rancière ever unpack that? I mean, did he do a history of that concept of intelligence,
right,
so that we have a better idea of what he means by that?
Yes, and the answer is really easy. He never did, right? He just didn't. And I want to say, just in some sense, his not doing it is an academic's dream, right? Because that gives me something to do, right? Right? Like if he'd done it all for me, now what would I do? I can just explain to you how he did it, right?
But it's, as I read his work, I
and I mentioned before you got into groups that my experience of reading was personal, right? That's to say, I was working with the black community. I'm reading him. I'm thinking, wait a minute, right? When we're firing all cylinders, this is what we're doing, right? So this led me to want to think about it more. And Rancière is a guy who is extremely suggestive, right? His thought is really fruitful and suggestive. Details he's not so good on, right? So it led me to start to think, because I obsess about details like this, right? What might he be on about here? And so I was thinking, Sarah, coming back to what you had said earlier, I was thinking about, well, it can't be that, right? It can't be that partly because it's so counterintuitive, but also partly because it's not necessary, right? What he's talking about is politics. What he's talking about is our relationships with one another. What kind of equality needs to be presupposed, right? And Mark, in working on that, what I gave you is still vague in general, but I'm not sure you can work it out much more than vague in general, but at least give a pointer, a sense of where it is that where it is that this equality of intelligence is pointing to. What are the necessary presuppositions for, in one case, political action, or in the other case, informing narrative work, right? What is it that we are doing? Right? We are taking this idea, equality of intelligence, right? People are able to form their lives, and right, the value is that we are presupposing it in our action. We are valuing it in that sense, okay? But I want to say this, there's still plenty to be worked out there, right? If it can be worked out, right? Mm-hmm. The great philosopher Aristotle once said that one should be precise about those things that one can be precise, and wisdom consists in knowing that, and in not being precise about things about which you cannot be precise, right? So it may be just one of those things about which we cannot be precise. Okay, let's do this. Let me just, we got 2 minutes, right? So let me just sort of quick run back through it again, right? So we see it, and then let you guys have lunch, right? Which I understand was, Meg, were you saying that the cafe?
It's superb.
Right, but like homemade stuff, right?
Specials and wonderful sandwiches.
Hey, come on, let me finish, because then you're going to get them hungry, not going to listen to a word that I say, right? What's it? Right, that's right. Right. Any of you who are not equally intelligent can drop out right now, right? So the idea is what narrative has involved, right, is in part a critique of forms of disempowerment, right, that is brought into the work, right? That critique of forms of disempowerment coming from Foucault presupposes something normative. Remember, normative, better or worse, not normal, normative, right? Presuppose something normative, that there are better ways of interacting than the ways in which traditional therapy does. Question is, what is being valued there, right? And what I'm trying to suggest is that if we follow the line of Rancière's thought, right, we might be able to see the kind of value that is informing narrative work, or at least one of the values, one of the essential values, informing narrative work in such a way that we can, A, right, better understand the work that goes on, but B, and this comes back to Denise, what Denise said, right, reflect on that space, right, in such a way as to ask ourselves, is this what's happening in this space between us, right? Right, in that relational space in which the presupposition of equality of intelligences reigns, not the presupposition of the identity of intelligence. Good? Okay, now Meg, you can finish this. I know how great the food is then. Okay, so,
Can I just say something that's totally throw a wrench in what you're saying?
Right.
But one thing that's sort of blocking this for me is when I think about someone talking to me and presuming a certain intelligence on something, sometimes they actually do the opposite of helping me to attend or want to make change in my life. So in other words, like, for example, I was recently talking to our tax person, and he spoke to me in a very, just assuming a level of intelligence that was unfortunately not there on my end. And by speaking to me with that assumption, I was like, you've lost me. I want to just throw up my arms. I'm not engaged now.
Right.
It sort of had the opposite impact that I'm imagining or discussing
Yeah,
here.
and here's the,
So I don't know, maybe I'm missing
I'm going to
this,
make a
but-
distinction and let
Yeah,
these folks go to
thank
lunch.
you.
I don't think the issue was the presupposition of equality of intelligence. The problem was the presupposition of the equality of background knowledge, right?
Yeah.
Right? If you had the background knowledge,
Well, that's
you'd have been
true.
fine.
Yeah.
That's why the equality of intelligence isn't the identity of intelligence,
I don't know,
right?
I'm not sure even with the background I would have that kind of.
But-
I
well,
get what you're saying.
I'll lend you my Einstein book on relativity. We can talk about that.
Okay.